Hello, friends. Welcome back to the cabin. My name is Tim Martin with Covenant Creation on YouTube. Well, today I have a sequel to my previous video titled Dust to Kingship. That video focused on the meaning of dust, life, and resurrection from Genesis 2:3 to the resurrection fulfilled in the first century. My friend Kyle sent me the article by Walter Brueggemann that he originally found referenced in this little book titled From Adam and Israel to the Church, a biblical theology of the people of God by Benjamin Glad. And Glad is a professor of New Testament at Reformed Theological Seminary. He has a PhD from Wheaton, and the book is published by InterVarsity Press. And you can see the reference from where Kyle saw it on page 13. He says, according to the narrative, therefore, receiving the breath of life is perhaps parallel in some way to being created in the image of God, particularly being created from the dust, may be likened to kingship. Footnote number 10, Walter Brueggemann, From Dust to Kingship, right there. So I really need to do a book review on this little book because it's an extremely helpful presentation of Adam and Eve as the beginning of the people of God, which is hardly controversial in temple theology. The parallel idea in preterist theology would be that Adam marks the beginning of the old covenant creation. And Glad accomplishes his task well by showing temple context from the very beginning of the Bible. Now, the reason I mention this book, Walter Brueggemann's article as referenced and cited in this book, is that I did have some complaints. Critics said that Brueggemann is a liberal and shouldn't be trusted or praised in any way. Yet it is conservative authors from Reformed Theological Seminary who cite him in their biblical theology books like this. Now, let me reiterate again, covenant creation is powerful precisely because it can be demonstrated from every theological perspective once full preterism is embraced. That's really my strategy here. My sequel today is based on Revelation 21:1 and John's statement, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also, there was no more sea. Now, today, I will be citing all conservative and evangelical authors, including Kenneth Gentry, Milton Terry, G.K. Beale, Peter Leithart, Marlin Harris, David Chilton, and last but certainly not least, Bob Cruikshank. These all provide the counterweight sources to balance out Walter Brueggemann from last time. So watch how these writers each demonstrate covenant creation from their own work. My point? Covenant creation is the protology for every form of full preterism. Now, the key to this sequel video is that Genesis 2-3 and the story of the garden contains no reference to the sea or to fish. Dust to Kingship was a close look at Genesis 2-3 in covenant context related specifically to Israel in the unfolding of biblical theology, as we saw culminating in resurrection. No more sea brings the full scope of Genesis 1 into that same covenant context for Bible eschatology. Special thanks to my friend Adam, again, for providing this image to help visualize the topic. He's done marvelous work for both of these two parts of these videos. The sea and fish and birds detail originates in Genesis 1, not later in the garden. In fact, Leviathan, which you see in the image sort of in the middle, the Tannanim, great sea creatures, are mentioned in the prophets as part of their eschatological vision. See Isaiah 27:1. But that shows how Genesis 1 detail and imagery forms the protology of one dimension of the biblical hope that comes to fulfillment in the first century. And the prophets understood that the sea was going to have an eschatology. Now, my point here is that the creation narrative is not Adam only at all. Furthermore, the details show how Genesis 1-4 form a united whole that cannot be dichotomized with eschatology if we pay attention to the biblical textual detail in fulfillment. Also, there is no more sea. From where does John get that imagery and detail for his final vision? Well, the answer seems obvious, as I will show in this video. Biblical imagery can be multifaceted and complex, signifying related details. Biblical symbolism is not simplistic like a code. It is imagery, and it captures multiple details or related concepts from different perspectives. Consider sea and waters in the Bible. They are related. Examples include baptisms, washings, judgment to death, resurrection to life, nations, firmament, sea of glass. Water brings life. Water brings death. Water is baptism. Water cleanses. Water is also chaos and darkness. There is also the salt water of the marshes that will not be made fresh. Ezekiel 47. I could go on, but you get the point. Different variations of sea symbolism can all be related in a covenant way. Symbolic imagery is like a diamond with many facets, so keep that in mind as I unpack this presentation. My goal is to, by the end, that you'll be able to see how different conceptions related to sea imagery are not strictly speaking contradictory, but deeply interconnected and complementary. Let's start by reading day 5 of Genesis 1, which is regularly associated with sea, nations, waters, firmament, and islands in the symbol package of the Bible. And I'll make some comments along the way. Then God said, "Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures." And when he says living there, you should think of life in the same covenant context, the knowledge of God, just as we saw last time in Genesis 2:7. Living creature, great fish that live in the sea. Maybe you could think Jonah there, and remember that Nineveh repented and believed God in that story, just like Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon later. Even Egypt had a believing Pharaoh in the days of Joseph, and these are, of course, sea monsters. Continuing on, it says, "And let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens." And that's a great example about how sea and firmament are related, especially since day 5 is parallel to day 2, where the firmament was introduced. But the idea is that the birds stay in front of the firmament. They don't go beyond the firmament. Adam, by contrast, is placed inside the firmament. If you look at my eschatology of the firmament presentations on this channel, that will be very clear to you. So God created bara, an ancient Hebrew verb root associated with fattening, like a sacrificial animal. Bara is also related to the later Hebrew noun, berith, which is translated as covenant throughout the Old Testament. But bara is ancient Hebrew, and it's used in creation only in Genesis 1:1, here on day 5 related to bara, sea creatures and birds, and then 3 times in Genesis 1:27 related to man on the land for the entire Genesis 1 text. All the other details in Genesis 1 are made, and the Hebrew there is asa, like a craftsman forms something out of pre-existing material, not created bara, like we see here for day 5. Now, if you diagram bara usage in Genesis 1, you'll see that God acts as bara, heaven and earth, 1:1, bara, sea creatures, that would be sea in 1:21, and God bara, Adam, image, male and female, 3 times in verse 27. And that unveils the explicit tripartite structure in Genesis 1, heaven, earth, and sea, which will become important in a bit. But it's really the source for the tripartite temple architecture that we see all through the Old Testament later. Let's continue. So God created bara, great sea creatures, and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abound, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw it was good, and God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. So the evening and the morning were the fifth day. Now, have you noticed that before? God gave the same blessing to the sea creatures and the birds of the air, that would be sea and heavens, and man on the land, earth. Now, traditionally, Adam gets so much attention in the creation narrative in Genesis 1 that Genesis 1:22 gets woefully neglected. God gave the same covenant blessing to creatures of the sea and birds of the air as to Adam on the land. That's earth, heaven, and waters, minus the dominion kingship dimension that we looked at last time. That is as profound as it is nearly commonly overlooked in Genesis studies. Remember that Adam is given the kingship or dominion in Genesis 1:27, reflected again in the movement from dust to life in Genesis 2:7 in the garden sanctuary context. And the pattern is set here for Israel to have an exalted place of dominion among the nations for God's priestly purposes, later in the development of Old Covenant history. Abraham marks a division between the land and sea through the covenant sign of circumcision, but the roots originate in Genesis 1, where God blesses all his living creatures. And I have to emphasize how this magnifies God's grace and love from the very beginning in Genesis 1. God loves and blesses all his creatures, not just Adam on the land. So we have grace, love, and blessing overflowing from God Most High. That's the name of God in Genesis chapter 1, who is Yahweh in Genesis 2. This citation will help you see the link between blessing given to the creatures of sea, birds of the air, and Adam on the land. This is from an important 2012 book by Peter Leithart titled Between Babel and Beast, that I plan to talk about in the upcoming part 4 of the 2024 Covenant Creation Curriculum series. Leithart sees the link with the unfolding covenant history, and he explains it this way. Because of the call of Abraham, the nations were organized around Israel. Israel formed the land at the center of the world, like the land that emerged from the watery chaos during the creation week, Genesis 1:2. All other nations were part of the turbulent sea that threatened to overwhelm the land and turn the world back to confusion. The new creation that took place in Abraham divided sea and land. Think circumcision. But simultaneously established a necessary connection between the two. Israel alone was the land, but the nations became the ends of the land and the islands. Gentiles formed the boundary of Israel's land, and as such, they were incorporated as the frontier of Yahweh's empire that had Zion as its capital. The Gentile sea thus belonged to the land of the children of Abraham, and this implied that the Gentile would eventually share in their redemption as light and life spread from Zion to the frontier, from Jew to Greek. So Zion as capital would parallel the inner courts garden scene of Genesis 2, but don't overlook the covenant blessing on the sea creatures in Genesis 1:20-22. This is radical grace in the creation account, and the goal and hope of the nations in Messiah will be manifested because of God's love. Genesis 1 is a temple dedication text structured in 3 parts: heaven, earth, and sea, which matches the Old Covenant jurisdictional boundaries. We're talking about legal boundaries here. We quoted Milton Terry in Beyond Creation Science, and he saw this tripartite structure introduced in Genesis 1 playing out in prophetic fulfillment in John's vision in Revelation 21:1. Terry writes, "And the sea is no more. To interpret this statement literally would be to bring confusion into the whole picture. Heaven, earth, and sea are mentioned as including all the elements, compare 2 Peter 3:10, and symbolic of what Paul calls the fashion of this world. So the temple architectural structure is a model, a symbol of the old covenant creation introduced in Genesis 1 through 3. That's why the end of the temple in AD 70 can be the sign of the end of the old covenant creation age, according to Matthew 24. It's not a sign of the end of the physical world at all. Why? Because Genesis 1 is a temple dedication text related to the old covenant creation. Now, the temple is not limited to Israel's worship alone. In fact, Isaiah declares it to be a house of prayer for all nations, just as Jesus echoes in the Gospels, particularly Mark 11:17. Israel's worship system offered sacrifices for the 70 nations for this very reason. It was a symbol of all of God's creation, united in praise and worship with Israel, serving as priests in the inner courts and sanctuaries like Adam. So you have the outer courts, which are called the sea for believing Gentiles to also gather at Israel's temple. But the point here is that we have grace, and more grace beginning in Genesis chapter 1. God always loved the nations. God pursued the nations, and many knew that their salvation would be accomplished through the Messiah of Israel in places like Jeremiah, who was known as prophet to the nations. So day 5 is focused on God's living creatures of waters and sky, fish and birds. And by the time of Noah, 10 generations after Adam, there are some land animals who will have the breath of life in them as well. Noah's flood was a covenant judgment that led to salvation of both Noah and the animals, clean and unclean, a type of the full consummation of the old covenant creation to come in Jesus's generation. Now we are ready to examine this excellent article by Ken Gentry titled The New Creation and No More Sea. Watch how this unfolds. In Revelation 21:1, an unusual statement appears at the coming of the new heavens and earth. And there is no longer any sea. Commentators have long debated the meaning of the absence of the sea in this text. Is this literal? And if it is literal, why would the sea not be part of the consummate order? Or is it metaphorical? And if so, of what is it a metaphor? The sea as literal. Walvard takes a strongly literal approach. The new earth apparently will have no bodies of water except the river mentioned in 22:2. He even argues that this must be a consummational reality beyond the millennium because other passages speaking of the millennium make frequent mention of bodies of water. Ryrie states that understood literally, this indicates a complete change in climatic conditions. Now, why do dispensationalists, including young earth creationists, insist on a literal meaning and physical fulfillment? Because they understand what seems obvious. John's vision is rooted in the original creation of Genesis chapter 1. And how did the dispensationalists demand Genesis 1 to be read? Well, thanks to the work of Henry Morris and John Whitcomb since 1961. If John says the sea is no more, then there is no more oceans when this vision is fulfilled. That's not really hard to understand, but continue now with Gentry. But if we understand this literally, it makes no theological sense. Why would the sea not be part of the eternal new creation order? Did not God recreate the new earth? Why would he not also recreate the sea? Did not God create and bound the sea at the original creation, Genesis 1:10? And is it not a feature of God's creative work, which is very good, Genesis 1:31? Now, Gentry confirms that the sea is a part of God's Genesis creation in Genesis chapter 1. What is fascinating here is that the cosmic temple view of creation, as promoted by G.K. Beale, maintains a physical view of Genesis creation. That is the basis for their futurism, since they believe the new creation has not arrived yet in fulfillment of John's vision. Last time I recommended G.K. Beale's The Temple and the Church's Mission. Well, he writes this way. Thus, after initially saying that he saw a new heaven and a new earth, John focuses only on an arboreal city temple in the remainder of the vision. Against this background, the Revelation 21 vision is best understood as picturing the final end-time temple that will fill, that is, future, the entire cosmos. And what he means by that is material creation. Now, what I find fascinating about Beale's book at this point is that chapter 1 is based entirely on John's vision of Revelation 21 to 22 as the foundation of his view. Yet Beale completely ignores the phrase, "there is no more sea," in the entire discussion. He doesn't make one comment about the phrase. He doesn't even bring it up, not even once in the entire chapter 1. The phrase is completely removed, like it doesn't even exist. Now, why? Why would he do that? Because if the sea in Genesis 1 is the oceans, great bodies of water, the cosmic temple view would necessarily mean that they would have to disappear in the end times fulfillment. And the sea of Genesis 1 would not exist. And that throws a wrench in the cosmic temple view, since part of the original cosmos of Genesis 1 ceases to exist at fulfillment. And it's not just the sea. Interestingly, this word beauty, Isaiah 60, is also associated with description of the heavenly light sources. It is spoken of as replacing the sun and the moon and shining on Israel in a greater way than these former light sources had ever done. The main light sources of the old creation were representations, though only faintly, of the glorious light that God would shine in the new creation. So sun, moon, and stars, like the sea, are also gone in John's vision of the new heaven and new earth. So get what this really means. The cosmic temple view of creation seems to be losing a great deal of the original cosmic temple introduced in Genesis chapter 1. Now you can see how this issue of the disappearing cosmos becomes acute for Ken Gentry in his article. Yet he doesn't seem to see the obvious implication. The sea as chaos. Many commentators understand the sea to represent chaos and woe in the world. In the Old Testament, the sea sometimes pictures the turmoil caused by the wicked, as in Isaiah 57:20. But the wicked are like the tossing sea, for it cannot be quiet, and its waters toss up refuse and mud. Jeremiah 6 reads, "They are cruel and have no mercy. Their voice roars like the sea." But again, God created the sea as an important part of his creation. Genesis 1. He owns his creation and he claims the seas. Furthermore, the sea is not invariably a negative image, for it can also represent good and abundance. Unfallen man, and specifically that's Adam, was given dominion over the sea in Genesis 1, 26 through 30. The sea's roar does not always picture man's rebellion, for the roaring sea represents God's power, and the sea rejoices in God. Note again this explicit claim from Gentry that the disappearing sea of John's vision is indeed the Genesis 1 sea. Can you see a train coming down the tracks? Gentry's conclusion unfolds in part 2 of his article. He says, "I believe the idea of the sea here pictures a barrier separating man from God. Let me explain. You've read this far, why not? In that the vision of the heaven and earth passing away signifies God's removing the old covenant order, as is appropriate given Revelation's theme 1:7, Probably the sea here continues that symbolism. Mealy presents a compelling argument that the absent sea in Revelation 21:1 refers back to the first use of sea in Revelation, the sea of glass, before God's heavenly throne. That sea appeared in a context emphasizing creation, which further links the sea imagery in 21:1. It also appears in a context emphasizing God's throne, while dealing with the removal of the old creation. But what is this sea's significance requiring its removal in the new creation? Well, do you see that? Gentry just taught the removal of the Genesis 1 sea by AD 70. Gentry has affirmed that Genesis 1 is the old covenant creation. And since we now live in the new creation, the new covenant creation, complete with oceans and all, then is it hard to see that Genesis 1 did not describe the material universe according to John's own teaching, and as taught by Kenneth L. Gentry? Thus, immediately after mentioning the absence of the sea of glass, John witnesses the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. In John's drama, the collapse of the Jewish temple in AD 70 opens direct access to God. If God descends with his New Jerusalem people, then the barrier of the glassy sea, which in the present age separates his dwelling from earth, will have to have been done away with. This is precisely what we see in Revelation 21:3-5. Now, I don't believe that Gentry has thought this through. The end of the firmament introduced in Genesis 1 destroyed? This was the point of my Montana conference presentation earlier this summer titled The Eschatology of the Firmament. Yes, the firmament of Genesis 1 has an eschatology in the Bible, as shown in the book of Revelation, and that eschatology of the firmament finds its fulfillment at the end of the Adamic age, at the end of the Old Covenant creation. Follow Gentry's own claim. He says, this new covenant principle of open access to God appears elsewhere in the New Testament. For example, we see this when Jesus promises that soon people will no longer need to worship in Jerusalem, but can call upon God from anywhere. This begins to occur when the temple veil is torn and creation is darkened and shaken. Matthew 27. For after that event, Christians are urged to draw near with confidence to the throne of grace because of the removal of the old covenant, which blocked access to the holy place. This removal of the old covenant is dramatically exhibited and finalized in AD 70. Wow. So the firmament of the old covenant creation in Genesis 1 disappeared forever when the symbol of the old covenant creation, the temple, was destroyed in finality in AD 70. I couldn't have said it better myself. Welcome to the covenant creation view of Genesis chapter 1, Dr. Gentry. I do believe the absence of the sea in Revelation 21 portrays just this image. The new covenant access to God is a major consequence of the removal of the old covenant and rituals portraying the hiddenness of God. As Christianity takes the place of Israel at AD 70, God's people can come boldly before the throne of grace in a way they could not have in the Old Testament. Ah, yes, the preterist view of Revelation 21:1. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also, there was no more sea. But I want to emphasize again that this is not a redemption or salvation that is limited to Israel only. Paul sees the scope of all creation formed together in the new man, in the last Adam. The end of the barrier between God and his people also ends the barriers among those who believe in God from various Old Covenant jurisdictions. Colossians 3 which is written in the context of Colossians 1, which is a new covenant creation text. Paul says, and have put on the new man who is renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all and in all. So the grace and the love and the blessing prophetically spoken before in Genesis chapter 1, with a blessing on the fish and birds and animals, has come to its culmination and telos in Jesus Christ, the image of God, the new Adam, who is all and in all. Peter Leithart offers this summary statement. He says, the original creation had a triadic structure, heaven, earth, and the waters under the earth. With the descent of New Jerusalem, that triadic structure is reduced to a simple duality of heaven and earth, a duality in unity, since heaven and earth are united in the bride city, who is one spirit with the Lamb. In the world of biblical symbolism, sea and land represent Gentiles and Jews. In the final new creation, there is no such distinction. All the people of God are earth and land, all of them incorporated together as bride. What that means is a remarkable conclusion, simply that the first creation has passed away. Now listen to this excellent clip from my friend Bob Cruikshank at the 2021 Berean Bible Conference. His presentation is titled The Millennium and the Second Exodus.
The removal of the sea, continues Methuselah, functions as the climax of an important canonical theme. The sea of chaos and affliction, which opposed God and threatened his people, which God has repeatedly subdued, is now judged in a new creative act at the climax of God's prophetic revelation. But this time, it's eliminated forever. All that is left is for God's people to enjoy God's presence in unending security. More than signifying some change in the geographical landscape, the removal of the sea expresses the hope of God's people in the final removal of all things that threaten and hinder them from the full experience of salvation. Marilyn Harris puts it this way: unlike the first creation, unlike the world after the flood, and unlike Israel in the promised land, this new world is eternally secure to the extent that chaos and evil are utterly powerless and unable to even threaten the communion of God and his people.
The first creation is Genesis creation, and it passed away? This seems to have amazing implications for the true meaning of the first creation in Genesis 1 through 4. Is that really that hard to understand? Now, I was preparing for my Montana conference last spring when I ran across Bob's presentation. So I reached out to Bob and asked him about this citation from Marlin Harris, and he sent me the full document. I couldn't believe what I found. Special thanks to Bob for finding this absolute gem. Link to the full article on the show notes if you want to examine it yourself. But let me just share the highlights, which absolutely establish covenant creation in Genesis 1 if you embrace full preterism. Here's the key. If you believe the vision of Revelation 21:1 has been fulfilled with the passing away of the old covenant and the arrival of the new covenant creation, you have necessarily embraced the end of the Genesis creation by AD 70. That's checkmate. Let me lay it out. Introduction. Few phrases in the Bible are more exhilarating than the words of John in Revelation 21:1 when he spectacularly declares, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. This vision of the future has stimulated the minds of Christians for hundreds of years and offered hope to many for the future restoration of God's creation. Yet within this exciting proclamation are also some of the most enigmatic words in the New Testament. The closing phrase of Revelation 21:1, "and the sea was no more," has caused much speculation by scholars and found little consensus on the meaning of this phrase. Some dismiss it as a passing phrase of slight importance, while others hold it up as one of the major interpretive keys to the entire book of Revelation. Even among those who believe that the phrase is significant, there is great debate over what the sea John envisions actually is. This lack of consensus leads to a number of important interpretive questions. Is the sea literal or figurative? If it is figurative, what does it represent? Is it related to other uses of the sea in Revelation? Is John drawing from the Old Testament allusions that he expects us to read into his statement in 21:1? How we answer these questions and others like them will have serious impact on how we understand Revelation as a whole. In this paper, I will propose that the words John writes in Revelation 21:1c, "and the sea was no more," are much more than a passing phrase to be glossed over. In fact, I am convinced that this phrase is the last consummate statement on a theme that is woven throughout the Bible from the very creation of the world in Genesis 1 and 2 to the final consummation of the new heavens and new earth in Revelation 21 and 22. I believe that when we consider Revelation 21:1c in its immediate context, it points us toward Old Testament threads that must be present in our minds if we are to properly interpret both John's general use of the sea throughout Revelation and his specific use in 21:1c. Once we understand the overarching theme that John draws from in this phrase, we will be able to better grasp and appreciate not only this short phrase, but also what he tells us regarding the new heavens and new earth in Revelation 21 through 22. Revelation 21:1c in its immediate context. When we consider Revelation 21:1c in its immediate context, it becomes clear that the sea was no more is intended to lead the reader back to the Old Testament. This passage forms a chiastic structure that progresses from what John sees in verses 1 and 2 to what John hears in verses 3 through 5. The chiasm is arranged in the following way. A, new heavens and new earth. B, first heaven and earth have passed away. C, the sea is no more. D, the new Jerusalem bride. And here's where we have the shift from vision to audio. D, dwelling of God with his bride. C, death, sorrow, and pain are no more. B, the former things have passed away. A, all things are made new. Wow, that is a powerful chiastic structure. And now we can unfold it some more. The scope of interpretation. Fortunately, John does not leave us completely in the dark when it comes to the range of interpretive possibilities available as we look for correspondences between the Old Testament and Revelation 21:1c. The chiastic structure of Revelation 21:1 through 5 reveals a correlation between the disappearance of the sea, that's C in the chart above, and the removal of sorrow, death, and pain, C in the chart above. This parallel leads to some helpful observations. One, the removal of the sea is clearly a blessing for God's people. Two, the very existence of the sea serves as a barrier to the establishment of the new heavens and new earth. And three, God alone is the one who is able to overcome the barrier and bless his people. These points of clarity delineate the framework by which we can now explore the Old Testament references to the sea that may lie behind John's words in Revelation 21:1c. The sea in Old Testament and ancient Near Eastern literature, creation. One of the indicators that John may be drawing from the creation story in Revelation 21:1 through 5 is his list of 7 things that will be no more. The sea, 21:1, death, mourning, crying, pain, and the former things, 21:4, and night, 22:5. Every one of these items that John lists is associated with the accounts of the creation and fall. The middle five can, in biblical tradition, be related ultimately to the effects of curse and the expulsion from Eden described in Genesis 3, echoing Zechariah 14:11, but with Genesis 3:17 also looming in the background. The first and last items that bookend John's list are representative of the pre-creation state of the world in Genesis 1:2, when darkness was upon the face of the abyss, and the Spirit of God moved upon the waters. Together, these 7 items represent 1, the order that God imposed upon chaos and disorder when he formed the world, and 2, the chaos and disorder that then entered the world when Adam and Eve sinned. The connection John draws between Genesis 1 through 3 and Revelation 21 through 22 should not surprise us. In fact, it would be odd for John not to describe the creation of a new heaven and new earth without hearkening back to original creation. Yes, indeed, that indeed would be odd, as every commentary in print today shows explicitly. Genesis 1 is the protology for John's vision. Absolutely no one denies this, nor ever has in the history of Christian theology. And it's very simple here to prove me wrong. Send me an example. I have looked for 25 years to find an exception. They don't exist. This connection between the original creation in Genesis and the final creation in Revelation 21:1c leads to a significant interpretive conclusion. You think? In order to remain consistent with our understanding of the sea in Revelation 21, the untamed waters of Genesis 1:2 must be understood as something that was not good. This is not necessarily a problem, for in Israel and in the rest of the ancient Near East, the sea was often depicted as a source of chaos, evil, and death that carried the potential to disrupt the order of the world. Now, hint, hint, the waters are associated with the firmament because day 2 and day 5 are parallel in the chiasm of Genesis chapter 1 because they are related. Therefore, the eschatology of the sea is the same as the eschatology of the firmament. This is exactly how biblical symbolism works. Harris next offers an overview of the role of the sea in 3 events in covenant history. The thematic unity of the creation, flood, and Exodus in these 3 historical events, we see common themes that collectively indicate a leitmotif, that's a recurring and overarching motif, that runs throughout the Old Testament. This leitmotif seems to play a significant role in Israel's understanding of God and how he accomplishes salvation for his people. All 3 episodes share a number of features. The sea serves as a barrier between God's people and land. That's the first one. Secondly, the presence of the sea poses a threat to the welfare of God's people. Number 3, God governs the waters to bring about life for his people and subjugation over his enemies. And 4, from his governing of the waters comes new life and new creation. In these 3 historical events, God lays down a precedent and model that his people can use to properly understand his character by his acts of salvation, judgment, and creation. From this explanation that is very good, I could add the typological element of these events, for the history becomes programmatic for the final consummation of the Old Covenant age, which is key to the book of Revelation. The sea in John's Apocalypse introduction. The book of Revelation is saturated with water imagery and comprises by far the greatest concentration of such imagery in the Bible or in contemporary apocalyptic literature. In fact, one of the greatest challenges to resolving the meaning of sea in 21c arises from how challenging it is to determine the level of continuity-discontinuity among the different ways he uses it. John uses sea imagery in a number of ways throughout Revelation. Some of the most striking uses are the sea as a part of the created order, the sea of glass in the throne room of God, the sea of glass mixed with fire, the sea as the abode of the beast and the rebellious nations, the sea as the means of trade for the harlot Babylon, the sea that gives up the dead in it, and the sea that is no more. We must sift through this litany of sea imagery in order to determine which ones, if any, might serve as an interpretive key to 21:1. However, while we do this, we must also keep in mind our prior survey of Old Testament sea imagery, which will serve as a hermeneutical guardrail and steer us toward a biblically centered and unified exegesis of the phrase at hand. And now we come to the conclusion of the article. The meaning of Revelation 21:1c. Now that we have surveyed the corresponding themes of sea imagery in the Old Testament and Revelation, we can piece together the greater meaning behind the disappearance of the sea in Revelation 21:1. The three major Old Testament events we have explored share a similar story. There is disorder and evil in the world, but God imposes his sovereign will on this disorder and uses the sea to establish a new creation. Yet in each story, the threat of decreation remains. Redemptive history shows us that the original creation, the flood, and the Exodus do not lead to the final stage of Earth's existence. What they do reveal and point toward is that the world needs to be recreated if God's people are to experience full and lasting salvation. But they all fall short of accomplishing what they point toward. And this is, of course, the function of typology. In many ways, the continued existence of the sea throughout these events serves as a sign and a reminder. As long as the sea exists, the threat of decreation and the need for a final recreation remains. Although God is completely sovereign over the waters, while the sea persists, both the threat of evil and the need for God's judgment endure. Furthermore, in each of these events, the sea also serves as a barrier to God's people inhabiting the land. In Genesis, the waters over the face of the earth must be subjugated and separated for Adam and Eve to multiply and fill the earth. Recall the covenant blessing of multiply and filling was also given to fish of the sea and birds of the air in Genesis chapter 1. But he continues to say, he says, this same command is also given to Noah when God causes the floodwaters to recede and gives Noah dry land to dwell on. That is, that Genesis 1 is in the background of Noah. Likewise, God causes the waters to recede in Exodus so that Israel can escape Egypt and enter the promised land. The continuity among these redemptive historical events undergird John's use of sea imagery in Revelation, particularly regarding the disappearance of the sea in 21:1. We see the same themes of creation, flood, and Exodus presented throughout Revelation. God's people are moving toward a final and lasting salvation, but the sea continually reminds the reader that danger remains. Evil threatens the security of God's people. Final judgment has not been accomplished, and the new creation remains to be seen. But throughout Revelation, there are glimpses of hope. God's saints emerge victorious over the beast and stand safely on the sea of glass mixed with a fire as they sing a song of victory. And Babylon is sentenced to destruction by being thrown into the sea. Then in Revelation 21:1, we see a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away. This statement leads us to a question. Is this the final creation event of redemptive history? Or is it like the first creation, the flood, and the Exodus, another redemptive historical event that fails to fully accomplish what it points toward. Think telos. This question is then answered in 21:1c, and the sea was no more. The absence of the sea is no mere observational add-on. It is the inaugural declaration that this truly is the final, permanent, and eternal recreation event. It is the fulfillment of the Old Testament shadow, and it resolutely declares that the world John is about to describe is unlike anything that humanity, and there we should add Adam or later Israel, has ever seen before. Unlike the first creation, unlike the world after the flood, and unlike Israel in the promised land, this new world is eternally secure to the extent that chaos and evil are utterly powerless, non-existent, and unable to even threaten the communion of God and his people. The absence of the sea illustrates this future reality, that is from his perspective as a Reformed futurist, in a unique way that brings absolute eschatological relief to the tension that has existed since the very creation of the world. Furthermore, it serves as the interpretive key that unlocks the unparalleled, once in an eternity newness of the new heavens and new earth. What's he saying? When the new covenant creation arrives, the old covenant creation, rooted in Genesis chapter 1, passed away in finality as a preterist, AD 70. The Bible moves from old covenant creation to new covenant creation. This has long been the preterist teaching from all the way back in the 1980s, even when preterists did not recognize the full implications for Genesis creation. Mandating fulfillment indicates covenant creation in Genesis. Here is how David Chilton described the displacement of the old creation with the arrival of the new creation. He says, the old world is completely replaced by the new. The word used is not neos, chronological newness, but kainos, newness and kind of superior quality. That is from Old Covenant to New Covenant. Earth's original uninhabitable condition of deep and darkness, Genesis chapter 1, has been utterly done away with. There is no longer any sea. And I absolutely love how my friend Bob Cruikshank captures the beautiful implications in his concluding statements at that Berean Bible Conference presentation in 2021.
Just as Adam and Eve were his image bearers in the original creation, we are his image bearers in the new creation. We need to know who we are and where we are on God's timetable. It affects how we live and how we view our mission in this world. And that's why I think it's so important to understand that the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 were symbolic hyperbole for that 40-year transition period. We're not in the transition period anymore. We are his image bearers in the new creation.
Thanks for that marvelous explanation, Bob. We are in the new creation because the first creation has passed away. The old covenant creation of Genesis 1 through 4 has entirely passed away. And by the way, the Millennium judgment of Revelation 20 is described in the comprehensive tripartite terms first introduced in Genesis chapter 1, because we read, heaven and earth fled, Revelation 20:11, and the sea also gave up the dead who were in it, Revelation 20:13. So heaven, earth, and sea, the same tripartite structure as we see in the temple architecture, as rooted in the Genesis 1 creation itself, dictates the end of the millennium was the end of the old covenant age. there can be no judgment from the sea in the new covenant because there is no sea in the new heavens and new earth. So the millennium marks the full and final end of the Genesis 1 through 3 Old Covenant creation. If the first creation has passed away, then Genesis creation has nothing to do with the material world. That fulfilled fact would make it the Old Covenant creation. So Old Covenant image bearers in the Old Covenant creation was a story of Adam and Old Covenant Israel in their Old Covenant purposes. We are now in the new creation, and that world has passed away. We are the new covenant image bearers in Jesus Christ, the image of God, quoting Colossians 1:15. My point here is to show you how that any particular resurrection doctrine is irrelevant to the covenant creation view that Genesis 1 creation has passed away at the end of the Adamic age. Covenant creation is the protology of all versions of full preterism according to the scriptures. If Revelation 21:1 is fulfilled, the first Adamic creation has passed away, precisely demonstrated by Bob Cruikshank's excellent presentation 4 years ago. Welcome to Covenant Creation, my full preterist friends. The story the Bible tells is far more glorious and beautiful than we have ever imagined. Not only did God's grace and love and blessing fall from heaven upon Adam, God's first covenant man, chosen to be the first priest and son of God by grace. That is beautiful indeed. It's a remarkable family story when you consider that Adam is taken from darkness. But now we can clearly see that the same overflowing grace, covenant love, and blessing was also given to the fish of the sea and birds of the air from the very beginning. They signify God's prophetic plan all along to redeem all creation, so that the goal of all creation is the profound declaration we see in John's final vision. And also, there is no more sea. This is the full covenant creation story that God the warrior uses to bring Jesus Christ, the tree of life, into our world and issue his covenant of peace with his people forever. He calls those living in darkness to come into the holy city through the everlasting open gates and drink of the waters of life freely. Thank you for watching Covenant Creation on YouTube. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this content. It really does help expand the message of fulfillment as we think through the profound worldview implications of full preterism and covenant creation in our world today. May God richly bless you in the city of light and life in Jesus Christ, our Lord.